Singapore was transformed forever by one man. In 1965, this tiny island with no natural resources was expelled from Malaysia, facing certain economic collapse. But today, this same nation boasts one of the highest GDP per capita on Earth. Starting from a poor backwater, Singapore became an economic powerhouse in just one generation. And the driving force behind this change was Kuan Yew. His determined leadership and hardline methods reshaped the nation and challenged conventional ideas of how to govern. Usually, strongman leaders are associated with mismanaged countries. But in this video, we'll look at how Kuan Yew broke the mold and created an economic miracle in Southeast Asia. On August 9, 1965, Kuan Yew appeared on national television, visibly shaken and tearful, to announce Singapore's forced expulsion from the Malaysian Federation. Singapore's situation was dire. With a land area of just 581 square kilometers and a population of about 2 million, the country lacked basic natural resources, including a reliable source of fresh water. The economy was in shambles, unemployment was soaring, and foreign investors were fleeing. Singapore's geopolitical position was equally risky, surrounded by potentially hostile neighbors and grappling with internal race tensions that threatened to erupt into violence at any moment. Kuan Yew understood the gravity of this situation. Small nations often struggle to achieve true independence, remaining economically vulnerable and reliant upon allies. Many experts predicted that Singapore would quickly descend into poverty and chaos, becoming little more than a footnote in the history of failed states. However, in this darkest hour, Lee made a decision that would alter the course of history. Instead of giving up, Lee took on the challenge of turning Singapore around, no matter the odds. He knew that there was no room for hesitation. Only bold, sometimes controversial actions would give Singapore a chance to survive and succeed. And Kuan Yew's first task was a high-stakes race to engineer a national identity from the ground up. The racial riots of 1964, which resulted in at least 34 deaths and over 560 injuries, exposed the deep-seated tensions between Malay and Chinese communities. These violent clashes were caused by the challenging demographic landscape of 1960s Singapore. With a population comprising approximately 76% Chinese, 15% Malay, and 7% Indian, each group harbored its own interests, cultural practices, and historical grievances. Lee understood that the survival of Singapore was hinged on forging these disparate communities into a single, cohesive Singaporean identity. To address this challenge, Lee implemented the ethnic integration policy. The program broke up ethnic enclaves by establishing quotas for each ethnic group in public housing estates. The policy effectively mandated integration at the most basic level of daily life, reshaping the very geography of the island to serve the greater goal of national cohesion. The strict enforcement of racial quotas in housing, education, and even marriage raised concerns about government overreach. However, Lee remained unwavering in his conviction that a unified Singapore was essential for the nation's survival and prosperity. Lee's language policy was another pillar of fostering a shared Singaporean identity. English was set as the common language for communication, while teaching in native languages was required to help people stay connected to their cultural roots. This approach aimed to create bilingual citizens capable of navigating both the global economy and their own cultural heritage. As these policies took root, Singapore experienced a gradual but profound transformation. A new generation grew up with a Singaporean identity as the norm. Over time, Singapore emerged as a model of racial harmony, with ethnic riots becoming a distant memory. It was Lee's social engineering that set the foundation upon which Singapore's future successes would be built, setting the stage for one of the most remarkable economic transformations in history. Kuan Yew's vision for Singapore was to create a first world oasis in a third world region. This ambitious goal seemed utterly unattainable for a tiny, resource-poor island at the time. Yet, Lee engineered an economic transformation that catapulted Singapore from poverty to prosperity in just a few decades. Foreign investors viewed Singapore as a risky country to invest in. Lee understood that for Singapore to survive and thrive, it needed to become indispensable to the global economy. So he focused on creating a pro-business environment. The Economic Development Board, established in 1961, aggressively courted multinational corporations by offering a stable political environment, low corporate taxes, and minimal restrictions on foreign ownership. But that wasn't enough. In order to compete globally, Singapore needed a highly skilled workforce. Lee's government invested heavily in education and vocational training, creating a pool of talented workers that could meet the demands of high-tech industries. Lee's economic strategy also capitalized on Singapore's strategic location in the Strait of Malacca. He pushed for the development of a world-class port, positioning Singapore as a major global trading hub. This move paid off handsomely, with Singapore quickly becoming a crucial link in international supply chains. The result of Lee's economic policies were astounding. By 2015, Singapore had transformed into a high-tech economy, with significant investments in research and development driving innovation across sectors. The nation's GDP growth rates consistently outpaced those of the most developed countries, often reaching double digits during peak years of expansion. Lee's unique style of authoritarianism allowed him to be extremely economically pragmatic and allow for rapid decision-making to implement growth-spurring policies. This model, often referred to as state capitalism, combines aspects of free market principles with strong government direction. While controversial, it proved remarkably effective in the Singaporean context. As Singapore's economy boomed, it joined the ranks of the Asian tigers alongside Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan. These nations were characterized by their rapid industrialization and high growth rates from the 1960s to the 1990s. Even among this elite group, Singapore stood out for the speed and scale of its transformation. But the same authoritarian tendencies that allowed for swift economic reform also raised questions about civil liberties and political freedom in Singapore. Kuan Yew believed that Western-style democracy was unsuitable for Singapore's unique challenges. So, his political system prioritized economic progress and social stability over individual liberties. This approach manifested in tight control over the press and harsh treatment of political opposition. To this day, Singapore consistently sits at the bottom of global rankings for press freedom. The government's use of defamation suits against journalists and strict media regulations have maintained a stranglehold on information flow, justified as necessary for social harmony. The case of J.B. Jeyaretnam, a prominent opposition leader who faced multiple lawsuits leading to his bankruptcy, exemplifies Lee's uncompromising stance against dissent. Policies like these extend deep into Singaporean society, implementing strict laws and heavy penalties for minor offenses. The infamous chewing gum ban symbolized Lee's belief in regulating even small behaviors for the greater good. Lee maintained that these measures were essential for Singapore's survival, citing his experiences during Japanese occupation as formative in shaping his views on governance through fear. But you can't argue that Singapore achieved remarkable stability and prosperity under his rule. The cost to civil liberties and political pluralism have been covered by the enormous wealth created over the last half-century. And all this economic growth transformed Singapore from a local player to a global influencer. Kuan Yew's foreign policy was shaped by his experiences during the Japanese occupation and was rooted in a pragmatic understanding of power dynamics and self-reliance. Lee encapsulated his view on international relations with the statement, "The essential quality of man has never altered." The core diplomatic task for Singapore was to balance its relationship between two powers, the United States and China. In order to strike this balance, there were two things that Lee had to achieve. The first was to establish himself as a neutral party, as a non-affiliated entity in Southeast Asia, much like the role that Oman plays in the Middle East or Switzerland plays in Europe. As a neutral city-state who could serve as an intermediary between competing powers, Lee would elevate Singapore's international standing far beyond its size. But the other essential element was to make Singapore as equally impenetrable as another neutral party like Switzerland. But Switzerland had the advantage of being a mountainous region that was incredibly hard to invade. But Singapore is just a little island at the end of the South China Sea. So Lee established a military strategy known as the poisonous shrimp doctrine. The doctrine posits that Singapore must maintain a military so formidable that larger powers would think twice before attacking. And now that Singapore had the economy to actually fund military power, it did so aggressively. In 2022, Singapore's defense budget reached over $11 billion, ranking among the highest in the world on a per capita basis. This high level of spending reflects Lee's defense policy, acknowledging Singapore's geographical vulnerabilities while leveraging its economic strength to create a powerful deterrent. Under Lee's guidance, Singapore has developed one of the most advanced armed forces in the region. The Singapore Armed Forces include a high concentration of troops, tanks, warships, and aircraft per square kilometer. The nation's recent order of F-35 fighter jets from the United States marks a significant milestone, making Singapore the first country in Southeast Asia to operate these cutting-edge aircraft. And central to Singapore's defensive posture is the concept of strategic depth. Given the nation's small size, there is a little geographic distance between its border and critical assets. This reality necessitates a military that can respond quickly and effectively to any threat, a requirement met by the SAF's high state of readiness. And Singapore's mandatory conscription system, which requires all Singaporean men to serve 2 years of military service, ensures that a well-trained and ready military force is capable of rapid mobilization at any moment. The brilliance of putting all these pieces together has earned Lee Kuan Yew acclaim from some of the top figures in global politics. Former US President Barack Obama referred to him as one of the legendary figures of Asia, and Henry Kissinger described Lee as one of the asymmetries of history, aptly capturing his ability to wield influence disproportionate to Singapore's size. And in the final chapter of Lee's skill as a leader, he set up the next generation to carry on his success. His approach to succession planning was characteristically meticulous. He created a system that would consistently produce capable leaders for generations to come, which involved actively recruiting and grooming a new generation of leaders equipped to handle the complexities of governing Singapore. Before he stepped down as Prime Minister in 1990, he carefully selected and mentored promising individuals, testing their abilities and resilience. Goh Chok Tong and Lee Hsien Loong were among those who rose through the ranks to eventually lead the nation. The effectiveness of Lee's strategy became apparent years after he left office. Subsequent leaders maintained many of Lee's core policies while adapting to changing circumstances. The emphasis on economic stability, social cohesion, and meritocracy remained central to Singapore's approach. Under new leadership, Singapore continued to thrive, with GDP per capita rising from around $14,000 in 1990 to over $70,000 today. Like all great leaders, Lee Kuan Yew does have his critics, but Singapore remains one of the safest societies in the world to this day. Quite simply, Lee Kuan Yew is one of the most effective nation builders in history. And I can't wait to continue to watch how that foundation stands up in the decade ahead. Thank you for watching.